When you sign in to Chrome, Google is taking all of your browsing history and slurping all of that up and using it to build a behavioral profile that they will target.
Welcome everybody to Techlore Talks. Today I am very excited to welcome on Bobby Holley, who's the CTO of Firefox, who's going to talk about Gecko and why Firefox still maintains Gecko as an alternative to Chromium, their privacy features, and how they even choose what features to prioritize inside the Firefox browser, cross-site tracking and fingerprinting solutions, ad blocking, AI, and how Firefox approaches AI, and a lot more. And of course, I want to wish Firefox a happy 21st birthday. So without further ado, let's dive into the interview with Bobby. I would love to welcome Bobby Holley on to Techlore Talks. If you want to say a few things about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Bobby Holley. I am the CTO of Firefox. I have been working on Firefox for 17 and a half years now, I think. So pretty much like my entire adult life. So I've worked on most parts of the browser, lots of different parts of the platform, parts of the front end, various things with standards and technical stuff and research projects and all that kind of stuff. So I'm very steeped in browsers and very passionate about browsers. One thing that is a major focus for us is privacy and security. So worked on a lot of security technologies and privacy technologies. And this is a particular focus for my team. So.
Yeah, and so what is, just very quickly, what does your day look like as the CTO for Firefox? What are kind of the big things that people maybe don't expect or do expect that you work on?
Well, a lot of video conferencing, as you might imagine. So that ends up taking a little bit more of my day than I would like. It involves a lot of, just coordination with, across engineering and, product management and stuff. And so just trying to figure out how we orchestrate everybody to be working on the most impactful things and shipping stuff out the door is a challenge because, we're a small team, we're playing against the giants and making sure that we, have all our wood behind the right arrows is important. I do try to divide my time between those more operational things as well as, strategic initiatives and stuff that we're trying to push forward, stuff like in standards. So one of the distinguished engineers on my team, Martin Thompson, does a whole lot of stuff in standards bodies, IETF, W3C, and trying to push forward various frontier technologies. I personally am sort of involved. I've been doing a lot of work on sandboxing technologies. So I was involved in some research collaborations where we put this cool WebAssembly-based sandboxing inside of the browser for C++. I'm also the chair of the board of the Bytecode Alliance, where we're trying to advance WebAssembly as a sandboxing technology outside of the browser. And then my group also does a lot of collaboration with the research community. And so we have a bunch of research partners helping us figure out things about how do you make agentic AI safe, which is some place that browsers are, hurtling towards in a very terrifying way. And then also things around how do we advance the state of the art on anti-fingerprinting? That's something we've been working on with UCSD for a bunch of years. So really a whole smorgasbord of stuff. It's really a dream job.
Nice. Yeah. Really important stuff too. And I definitely want to talk about AI because I know that's getting bigger and bigger. And it seems like every day I see a new announcement. But before then, some fundamentals for Firefox. With Chromium dominating the internet, people kind of look to you as a beacon, as an alternative because you guys run on Gecko. So why do you guys stick with Gecko? And do you plan to stick with that long term? And do you ever see a scenario where you move to Chromium for any reason?
Yeah, so from my point of view, we are going to continue building and investing in and shipping Gecko as long as it is humanly possible to do so. Because Gecko is one of the principal ways in which we have leverage and our ability to move the ecosystem. And so when web standards are made, right, there are basically three people at the table, and one of them is Apple, and one of them is Google, and the other one is Mozilla. And we, I think, are the last representative of sort of this independence of building the web and internet stack that isn't dominated by the two entities that dominate everything else. Building Gecko is mind-bogglingly expensive. It was too expensive for Microsoft. They got out of the game, and there was no reason why anybody would do it, except that it's the right thing to do, and that's what Mozilla is about. And so I think we are very committed to doing this and very committed to using it to advance our objectives and mission in the world.
Yeah, do you ever stumble on friction points? I mean, behind the scenes, it's just a person and a team. Do you ever go, man, it's tempting sometimes to look at the Chromium alternative, or is it day by day, is that mission just so kind of there that it's not even a consideration?
I don't think it's really a consideration. It's just fundamental to who we are. I do think that it makes, you know, it adds a lot of extra challenges for us that like our competitors don't necessarily face, right? Because of all you're doing is you're taking a copy of Chromium and you are, just like putting some new window dressing in it, right? That is a lot easier. You don't need as large of an engineering team. You don't need like a team. You don't need like a world expert in just-in-time compilation and in garbage collection and all of these technologies that are really kind of just embedded throughout the browser of networking stacks and graphics and layout and media playback and video conferencing and cryptography and like the list just goes on, right? And so that is just like a huge amount of effort, and it's a team that we've built like over decades, and it is expertise that we've built, and I'm proud of that expertise. But it would be really hard for like anybody else who wasn't already in this game to build that expertise. And so I do think of it as Mozilla's real duty to represent the sort of open multi-stakeholder interoperable web. And I do think that we have a lot of leverage. Obviously, like, our market share is like nowhere close to the size of, Apple and Google. But one thing that happens in those standards conversations is that Apple and Google kind of just by default disagree with each other. And so we often get to steer the conversation towards what we really think is best for the web and best for users. And by kind of bringing that high-minded approach into those standards conversations, we can often drive a consensus that would not have been achievable and would not have been as really pro-mission as would have happened otherwise.
Yeah, and one of the struggles I see doing anything associated with Apple and Google, we struggle with this as well. A lot of our community, they want to really figure out what's going on because they're sold this idea that Google and Apple care a lot about their privacy. They market privacy a lot. How do you compete with that? How do you kind of like break through the noise and kind of show people what privacy means and still kind of have some layer of leadership when Apple and Google are trying to take that leadership away from people who maybe are a bit more privacy respecting?
Yeah, I think, it is incredibly challenging to compete with Apple and Google, right? If you were to, pick your competitors, those are not the big competitors that you would pick. And they benefit from a huge amount of distribution, of, being the defaults and shipping the operating system and all that kind of stuff, right? And so we survive because people choose to use Firefox, and they choose to use Firefox because they care about what we stand for and they care about the work that we do. And so with respect to, the topic of privacy leadership, I think the way we do that is by actually shipping things that improve privacy and that move the ecosystem. So, well, I don't know. Should we get into that stuff, or I don't want to.
Yeah, I mean, just before we kind of dive into the privacy and security features, just very quickly, kind of what do you define success as for your team? Like, if you guys are coming together, is it more user engagement? Is it market share? Like, what do you kind of, yeah.
Sure, right. So the message that I give year over year to the Firefox team is very simple. Like, we have two objectives. The first is to build a world-class browser, and that is a prerequisite to like us being around the next year, right? Because if we ever build a browser that is not as good, competition is only a click away. Users will switch browsers, and we will no longer have any leverage or product in the market. And then the second thing is using that browser as a vehicle, as leverage to advance our mission in the world. And you can do things where even if you're, not the dominant player, you can find strategic ways to push the envelope and push the industry and make the internet better. And that is fundamentally what Mozilla is about. And so, we do need to survive to continue being at the table. But ultimately, that is in service of making the Mozilla mission, which is about an internet that is a global public resource and open and accessible to all, making that continue to be a reality.
Yeah, and then privacy is, I'm sure, a big part of that. So what are kind of the main privacy features that you guys are, I guess, proud of? They can be long-term, they can be recent. I don't know what kind of comes to mind as the most noteworthy.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about privacy for hours, so you're gonna have to keep me honest here with
Go for it. I'll do my best.
Yeah, so like our basic vision for privacy is that whatever you do on the internet and on the web should be private and is your business, and it does not belong to anybody else between you and whoever you're communicating with, and that should be the default. And the unfortunate situation was like, as of 10 years ago, this was just like not the state of the web, and people were just being spied on everywhere they went, and multiple dimensions of the stack, right? And so, probably the most egregious one of these was cross-site tracking, right? Where people abused this notion of third-party iframes and the fact that there was non-partition storage to basically put these tracking cookies like everywhere. And so basically, as you would browse across the web, there were just like dozens of entities that were just building a profile of your browsing history. And so Mozilla led the way with cracking down on this with the deprecation of third-party cookies. We partition them, and first we did this thing called enhanced tracking protection, and then total cookie protection. And that has been like a major, I would say, earth-shattering change in like how the industry works. Like Apple also is like in a similar position with like not allowing third-party cookies. It was looking like maybe Chrome would eventually get there. Sorry, what?
Sorry, I was going to ask exactly what you're going to get to if Chrome has integrated it yet.
Yeah, so it was looking like maybe they would get there. And honestly, like speaking of the Mozilla mission, like that is a victory condition, right? Like, yes, it makes us like it would make us less differentiated from Chrome, but it would also mean that like so many millions and billions of people on the internet would have better privacy. Like we would love to see Chrome remove third-party tracking from the browser. And there was sort of a situation maybe like in like 2018, 2019 when Firefox was doing this and we were getting a lot of press. It was when I really first appreciated this notion of earned media. Like there was this amazing Washington Post piece where the reporter was like, did all these diagrams and sort of cute animations of being just like followed around by like all the trackers on the internet. And so Chrome really started a push to get there. But unfortunately, they ran into some headwinds, and some of these were like related to their business, but also some of them were related to the advertising industry not being happy about this and going to competition regulators around the world and saying that Chrome was being anti-competitive for improving the privacy in the browser by sort of boxing out the third-party tracking industry. And they got some traction with that, right? And then so Chrome was in a complicated situation for a while for a number of different reasons, and they tried to advance this suite of APIs called Privacy Sandbox, which we had a lot of concerns about and largely suggested like a lot of these things shouldn't happen. And thankfully, they've recently retired a lot of these. Some of them were like, if you actually did this in a different way, you could have like good privacy properties for that. But eventually, like they just ran into so many headwinds from the advertising industry and from regulators that they just gave up. So, they announced earlier this year that they are not deprecating third-party cookies. And so now you really have like a bifurcation in the privacy properties of the web between browsers that allow third-party cookies and those that don't. But like, even I would say, that's like the 85% of the battle with cross-site tracking. But there's still, more to do there, right? Because sites try to find sneaky workarounds to kind of reignite this cross-site tracking, right? And so there's this notion of bounce tracking protection where you use parameters and you bounce somebody through like an intermediate storage, and then you use that to create persistent state. And so we've been working on things like bounce tracking protection to kind of put a stop to this. There are situations when it is tied with necessary functionality. Like one common use case of this same sort of technology is for federated login of, and so sometimes like it's a little difficult to tell like what are the good use cases and what are not. And so we've been working with other browser vendors to advance like specific APIs for things like federated login, this thing called like FedCM Core that we're working on. And then, honestly, like one of the most pernicious forms of cross-site tracking is based on fingerprinting, right? And that is a situation where where a website is basically using the characteristics of your device to try to create a unique and passive profile of that uniquely identifies you. And so we have done a lot of work, and this was, in collaboration with our research partners at UCSD. Fingerprinting is an incredibly difficult problem, right? Because there are a lot of different signals that are exposed to websites, like as part of the DOM and JavaScript, that create bits of entropy, and it's really difficult to make everybody look exactly the same. But we've done some research to figure out like what are the things that actually tend to differ, and what are the things that tend to make people unique. And we recently shipped some fingerprinting protections that basically like drop the number of, cut the uniqueness by half in Firefox that we're very proud of. And this is across like many different APIs of like, fonts and canvas and rendering and, web audio, etc. And then, probably the most, one of the most obvious fingerprinting vectors is your IP address, right? Because that is often like a unique thing and is part of the protocol when you are communicating with websites. And so obviously you can use VPNs, and this is sort of the standard solution of like for people who want to have that level of anonymity online. But one of the problems is just like it's hard to set up. Like there's friction. You have to install something, and people have to pay for it. And so like my dream has always been for like a number of years that we figure out like how we can just like make it. We just put like a free VPN as part of Firefox. You just like turn it on, and it just works. And the problem is that's like very expensive because you have to like pay somebody to proxy all of that traffic. But we are looking really hard at it. So I don't want to say quite yet that we're going to be able to do it, but it is something we're really looking at integrating into the browser in 2026. So those are sort of the major vectors of fingerprinting. There's another aspect of cross-site tracking where people use identifiers to do backend re-identification and combination, right? And so like, you like visit a site and they're like, sign up for a newsletter. It's like 10% off, right? And you're like, oh, like, hey, how generous of you, right? And the reason is like, I mean, maybe they care a little bit about spamming you, but mostly what they're trying to do is to get your email address. And then they take that email address and they like send it to Facebook and they send it to, like whatever their advertising platforms are. And on the back end, they are then using that to reconstruct a profile of what you're doing using human identifiers like, your email address or your phone number or something like that, right? And that's like tends to be pretty difficult to deal with because, people tend to use the same one across all those things. So we have this new thing that we have integrated into Firefox, Firefox Relay, that allows you to sort of create unique email addresses to use like in these situations. So if you do want to sign up for the newsletter for whatever reason, right, you can do that in a unique way. Totally separate from Firefox, we think that this is like a big problem in the industry. And so Mozilla has sort of this completely separate arm called Anonym, which is trying to design like a privacy preserving stack with verifiable guarantees for that practice. But it's not like at all related to browsers, right? It's just like trying to do some harm reduction in the industry. So those are like the major aspects of what I would refer to as like content level cross-site tracking. But there's also a lot of issues on the network. So, historically, maybe like 10 years ago, like the situation with encryption on the internet was like really bad. Like less than like 30% of web traffic was encrypted. And we had to like fight tooth and nail to get encryption built into like new web protocols that were being designed. Like Martin Thompson on my team was the one who really pushed and succeeded in making push notifications in the browser like actually have end-to-end encryption. But that was sort of considered optional at the time. Since then, I think in large part because of successes of Let's Encrypt, Mozilla, helped found this entity to create basically free and automated certificates, along with protocol improvements like TLS 1.3. Like we've gone to like over 90% of like the US internet web traffic like being encrypted, which is just like absolutely amazing. Because there are lots of potential intermediaries in your network, like, your ISP, like whoever's running your coffee shop, your airline, that can otherwise be looking at what you're doing online. But even when you get to like that level of encryption, like there's still, unfortunately, like some other like chatty parts of the stack. And so, a couple examples of these, one of them is certificate revocation. So this is a protocol called OCSP, where when Firefox or, like a browser is trying to do the PKI authentication to make sure that it's like talking to the right server and making sure that like the encryption is working, correctly and you're talking to the right counterparty, that it has to do some lookups to ensure that the certificate hasn't been revoked, and those leak your browsing activity to like other, parties on the network. And so we recently shipped a technology called CR Lite, which uses like some very clever compression and Bloom filters and all this stuff to basically ship like an offline set to all of the browsers of all of the revocations, like every 12 hours, I think. So that basically means that like Firefox can check for the entire set of revoked certificates like online without ever having to make a network connection that reveals what you're doing, right? So like that's one. There is DNS is another chatty part of the protocol. Like if you use legacy DNS, then basically the domain names that you are visiting are constantly being sent in the clear with your IP address attached to whatever your DNS resolver is, which can be like your ISP or some router on your network. And so in various regions, US and Canada in particular, by default, we ship something called DNS over HTTP or DNS over HTTPS, which is encryption for those DNS lookups. And we've also added a technology called encrypted client hello, which is intended to make sure that the initial connection to the website, which ordinarily reveals with the SNI field what the domain you're visiting, is encrypted as well. So there's just like a whole bunch of that stuff where we're just like systematically burning down the ways that people can spy on you on the internet.
Yeah, and I appreciate kind of the holistic approach to it. There's a lot of services that I have a lot of respect for, but it's almost seen as existing in a vacuum of like, yeah, we're protecting against these things, but it's kind of the user's responsibility to figure out the rest of the stack. And where that leads is using all the typical tools, like using a non-end-to-end encrypted messenger, using a non-privacy respecting browser, using all these social media platforms. Oh, but on Linux. And it's like, it's exposing the irony there, and it's totally fine. I think if everyone is using those services on Linux compared to something like Windows, it is still a net benefit. But it speaks to how a lot of these tools are seen as living in their own existence. So I think I really appreciate you guys kind of expanding beyond that and thinking about how to make things easier for the users. I wanted to ask about inspiration from other projects, because you brought up a lot of these great tools. And a common narrative I hear online, and I don't know if this is true, is that the Tor browser is kind of like a nice testing ground for a lot of these privacy tools, and then some of those tools eventually find themselves in Firefox. Would you say that's an accurate narrative, or what does that actually look like behind the scenes?
Yeah, 100%. Like the Tor project is like super awesome, and a number of years ago, it used to be that they, worked off of a fork of Firefox, and they like had a bunch of patches, and then every time that we would make some changes, they would have to go and rebase all their patches, and it was just like it was a mess. And so we did this thing called the Tor Uplift project, where we took a bunch of the Tor patches, and like some of them, like the reasons we weren't able to ship all of them is that some of them just like break too many websites, right? Because for certain things, unless you do like a lot of very careful work to like optimize the trade-offs between privacy and web compatibility, you could just break a lot of websites, which like obviously if you're trying to completely optimize for privacy, which Tor browser users are doing, like that's totally the right trade-off. But if we were just to ship this to all of our users, they'd be like, like why is my Google broken? And it would be a problem. And so what we did was we took a bunch of that functionality and a bunch of the technical infrastructure inside, like resist fingerprinting, and added it as sort of like a configurable knob inside of the core browser codebase. And then we have been leveraging that as we go. And like now we're doing this work to ship these fingerprinting protections, to a larger population of users. And a lot of that is leveraging that. And there's been a lot of like great cross-pollination, like some of our, security and privacy experts like deeply involved in the Tor project. And so only positive things to say there.
Got it. And I have a couple more technical questions, but I have one more kind of inspired by how you started here. You talk about all these privacy protections in Firefox. If someone is listening to this podcast and they're still using Google Chrome, a very quick TLDR on kind of what they're overall gaining when they move to something like Firefox, and maybe what they're losing when they're using something like Chrome. But also, is that the default way that most people should use Firefox? Do you think somebody just installing Firefox and just using it out of the box is kind of the ideal way for the average user? And if someone wants more, where do you normally send them? Because way back in the day, it's like install bajillion extensions and adjust all these flags. And luckily, I think we're well past that point. Most people don't suggest this anymore as a real solution. But I'd love to hear kind of your feedback on this.
Sure, yeah. So, I guess starting with that first question of what are you losing when you're using Chrome? So there's a few different ways that like a browser or, service provider, can be set up in terms of what posture they are offering you. And with Chrome, when you sign in to Chrome, Google is taking all of your browsing history and slurping all of that up and using it to build a behavioral profile that they will target ads on the Google search results pages, as well as display advertising across the internet with AdSense, right? And so the trade-off you're signing up for there is that you are using Google services, and they will build a behavioral profile of everything you do, and you are sort of trusting them to, utilize that responsibly. Which works for a lot of people, right? But it's not really what I'm looking for. Then when you go into more of the privacy space, there are a number of providers that I think are absolutely doing great work, and I'm like super happy that there are lots of players in the privacy space, because that just means that the space is like so much more vibrant, and it matters so much more than it did like 10 years ago. But for a lot of players, the overall posture is that you trust them not to build a behavioral profile of what you're doing, right? And so, for example, like if you do like a search on DuckDuckGo, they forward that to, Bing under the hood. And their whole proposition is that they are not forwarding along your identifying information, and that they are not storing what you're searching for. And like, I absolutely believe them. I think that they're like, I know lots of, very passionate privacy people who work at DuckDuckGo. I don't think that they are like cheating on this. But there is still an element of trust. And the thing that we are really trying to push for with Firefox is like an even stronger posture, which is what I would refer to as verifiable guarantees of privacy. Like, the idea is that we are trying to build and develop protocols such that you can verify at a technical level. You don't even have to trust Mozilla, right? That is our posture, that like, we do not learn what you are doing online. And you don't have to trust us on that. You can look at the source code, and you can look at the protocols we deployed, and verify this for yourself, right? And so that originally meant that, we had some, we were one of I think the first browser to deploy end-to-end encryption for the synchronization of bookmarks. Like if you use a Firefox account, you're synchronizing your bookmarks, and those are end-to-end encrypted. And then it meant for a while that we like weren't offering various services that we couldn't figure out how to do. We've started to build some cool new protocols like Oblivious HTTP, one of protocol that Mozilla helped to develop, basically allows for a verifiable guarantee for a web service, right? And so, we just announced this sort of like search in your address bar feature. And the cool thing about that is that the traffic goes like the queries go to Mozilla, but they go through Fastly using a sort of Tor-like protocol, such that Mozilla cannot learn what an individual is searching for. And so that is the posture that we are ultimately shooting for, and we want to move the industry in that direction, not because we don't trust people, but we just think it is better when there are technical guarantees of things. So that was the first question. What was
Yeah,
the
and then
second?
kind of, if you generally suggest just default Firefox for the average person, and if that's all they need, and if someone does want more, where do you typically send them?
So there's a couple things there. I mean, one of them is that, I have long ago had to learn that like I am not the average user. So we have like on the new tab page for Firefox, there is like a story feed, right, of like thought-provoking stories. And this personally for me is like the last thing I want when I like open a tab, is to be like distracted by news stories. And so it's the first thing I do in any Firefox profile to turn this thing off. When I looked at my wife's computer and she was using Firefox, and I was like, oh, you can turn that thing off. And she's like, what, are you kidding? Like, that's my favorite part, right? And so like, it is actually something that like users love. And we want to make sure that like we are giving people the kind of experiences that they want. But so there, I guess one piece is that there are various configurations that you can make. Like you can just like go and like turn off those stories, right? It's just like one click to make the browser feel however you want it to feel. On the subject of like extensions, probably the biggest extension that I am a huge fan of is uBlock Origin. It's sort of the world's most powerful ad blocker. It uses some technologies that Chrome like intentionally tried to remove from Chromium because it was too powerful for ad blocking. And that was this whole notion of Manifest v2 versus Manifest v3. And because we are not using Chrome's implementation of the web platform, we have our own in Gecko, we can continue supporting that. So uBlock Origin continues to work great in Firefox. Definitely something that I recommend to people who want that. And then there are additional ways that you can turn up privacy protections even further. There's this feature in Firefox called Enhanced Tracking Protection Strict that goes even further in terms of like applying changes and tweaks like additional fingerprinting protections that can break websites. And so that's sort of like an opt-in thing, and it's really up to users of how much they want to really dial up the privacy further than the default at the expense of things breaking. And we're doing a lot of research and work to try to like resolve that and bring as much as possible into the default configuration. But really, like the breakage of websites is one of the primary reasons we have to have like some of those extra knobs still.
Nice. And yeah, I've noticed that over the years, even when I've been in the space, of the pattern where you guys will introduce a new privacy feature, and maybe it's only located behind a toggle first, or maybe it's a bit harder to enable, and then over time you do see it become just kind of a standard feature, which is really awesome. On V2, V3, you kind of implied, because I'm hearing mixed things here. So I was at the Ad Filtering Dev Summit just a couple weeks ago now, and you have Chrome engineers who are there who helped develop the extension technology. You have people behind some of the best ad blockers out there. uBlock Origin is very much around there. And, there's this kind of, it's an interesting mix of people who all have different values and working on very, very different projects that sometimes are compatible, sometimes aren't. And the Chrome people aren't of the belief that V2 and the V2 to V3 upgrade for the extension technology is strictly to prevent ad blockers. I don't know if you have any opinion on this that you feel comfortable sharing, and what it means kind of for the future of ad blocking.
Yeah, so I don't have insider information into the internal rationale of the Chrome push to deprecate MV2. All I can say is that I feel like the rationale for continuing to do that, specifically with the deprecation of web request with the replacement of declarative net request, I'm not persuaded by that rationale as being a good reason to push forward with such a controversial change that so many users were so upset about. So I will leave it at that.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And are you guys like fully committed to maintaining V2 kind of indefinitely? What's that look like?
Yeah, I mean, we want to maintain like whatever is necessary to deliver the maximum control of experience that users want, right? Like ultimately what the web is about is like the web is this amazing platform, which everyone takes for granted, but we shouldn't, that the site provides a suggestion of how it should look, right? But that is reinterpretable content that is ultimately rendered by an agent that is under your control, right? And that is just amazing. That is like how things before the web looked like, and that's not how things that came like after the web, like native platforms looked like on mobile. And it's really just a historical accident that this sort of like markup-based platform ended up being the way that experiences are delivered. And we want to make full use of that and allow users to have agency and control of their experience. And so all that is to say is that like if the elite ad blocking community like asked us to add like new APIs like further than web request, yeah, we would be totally on board with doing that. At the moment, like the easiest thing to do is to continue supporting web requests, and that seems to work pretty well with the uBlock Origin. But that's we are definitely open to suggestions, and it is like really core to what we're about, to empower users to experience the internet on their own terms by controlling how their content is interpreted and rendered.
Yeah, and then I want to dive into AI and some other feature-related stuff as kind of the third phase of our interview. But before then, what's the rationale? Someone might be hearing this and going, "Oh, uBlock Origin sounds really good." So, is there a reason you don't have it by default in Firefox and it's an additional extension, by any chance?
Yeah. So one of the issues of building our own engine is that it makes it harder for us to blend in with the crowd. Right. And this is, one of the burdens that we bear of building an engine because we think it's so important. But it means that sites sometimes have to do extra work. Like maybe they build something that's actually based on a Chromium bug, and then we're like, oh no, actually you have to fix it to, match the correct version of the standard, and here's this. Or basically, we have a lot of open dialogue with websites to try to make sure that sites work well. And my general belief is that if we did something like what you're proposing, it would create a lot of hostility from website authors, and in a way that might ultimately result in Firefox not being viable. And so for me, it's very important that we maintain Firefox as an open and independent browser, and that we provide users the option to configure their experience how they choose. But we have to be a little bit thoughtful of, maintaining a good relationship with the websites that people use in Firefox.
Got it. And so kind of moving into AI then, what is your guys' approach to AI? Because at least in our space, it's a very love or hate thing. And yeah, I think it caught some people off guard that you guys started approaching AI and starting to release AI features, but I've been embracing AI a bit more, and so I'm not necessarily against it. And so yeah. So what's your guys' approach internally to AI, and how do you think AI kind of fits into people's worlds nowadays?
I would say like my overall intention for Firefox and my own view is like to take a balanced approach. The key thing to understand about anything AI in Firefox is that we are not forcing it on anybody, right? Everything that we do like with AI is like an optional feature that you can use, my favorite AI feature in Firefox is one that we've actually had for a couple years, which is the page translations, right? And these are page translations that run entirely locally on your device with a local model. When previously, like the only way, if you were, if you're an expat living in a country where you don't speak the language, you would be basically browsing all of your web with server-side translation, where you're just like sending everything to Chrome or to Google like all the time for Google Translate.
How large
right?
is that model?
It's we got they're pretty small. Like they're the models are specific to language, right? Like English to French or something like that. But it's like on the order of 30 megs.
That's impressive. I would have guessed more than that, so that's pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean they're not the LLM style, right? They're using something different and that is more specialized, and it's actually like we've engaged in a bunch of research. Like we have got like research partners in Europe in particular. There was sort of a government initiative around this to try to create better opportunities for translation and making them more private. And so that is we've looked into potentially switching to more of like an LLM based stack for that, but like the size is an issue. Sorry, where were we?
Yeah, just AI in general and your guys' approach.
Yeah. So AI in general, right? So the first piece is that the any AI features we ship are like totally up to you, like whether you use, and we're not going to force them on you. The reason we are doing some stuff is that I do think that AI appears to be a transformative technology, and there's a lot of aspects of it of where there's like hype, and there's aspects where people are doing things that I think are not ready yet, or like possibly even quite dangerous in terms of some of the unsolved security challenges with respect to using agentic browsing in a context where the browser has all of your sensitive information and is also interacting with untrusted content and has the ability to exfiltrate, right? It's like Simon Wilson calls this the deadly triad or something like that, the lethal trifecta. And so that is something where we're trying to help figure out what this should look like, because it's very clear that for some segment of users, like the security concerns aren't going to stop them, right? There's just so much desire from some people to have experiences where the AI is like very deeply integrated. And so what we don't want to do is to be in a situation where Firefox is just sitting this one out, because AI is going to be changing a lot of how things operate. And if we just leave it up to Chrome to stick Gemini into Chrome and define like what AI looks like on the web and what it means, and we're not playing in that space at all, I think that could potentially be bad for Firefox in the sense of people looking for that, like feel like Firefox isn't a viable choice for them. And it also could be bad for the web because we wouldn't be really engaged in showing up in terms of trying to identify like how things should be. One thing that we're really concerned about is that the reason there's all this attention on browsers is because browsers are the touch point to consumers on desktop. And these AI companies are attempting to really own the channel with the consumer. And so Chrome and Google are obviously trying to leverage the dominance of Google Chrome into dominance of Gemini. And they're doing this in a few ways, right? Like the Chrome browser is now got like 500 Gemini integrations that are like very difficult to get rid of if you don't want. And they're also even putting it in the web platform, right? They're pushing forward with web platform APIs that are, nominally model agnostic, but in practice, the intent is to get web developers accustomed to the way that Gemini operates, right? Because it's a really cool thing as a web developer to be, if you're trying to do some AI thing, to be able to offload your inference onto the client. And that's a really attractive proposition. And in practice, because so many people use Chrome and Gemini is going to be the model that's available for those APIs, people are going to tune their experiences and their just general technical expertise and know-how to how Gemini works. And that's all part of entrenching the dominance of Gemini, which is what Google is trying to do, right? And so this is sort of a no-holds-barred war to own the space and control AI and own the touch point with the consumer. And we are attempting to show up and provide people choice and optionality. So AI features that we're putting in, we have local models. You can like configure them to use different models. Insofar as we do stuff with server side, it's all going to be like optional. And the intent is for you to be able to choose like whichever model or backend you want to use. And so that's, the way that we're attempting to show up here.
Very nice. And then the last major question I had has to do with the DMA in Europe, which allows third-party browser engines on iOS. Is that something you guys are looking at? Is there any potential for a Gecko-based iOS app? Because correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think anyone's actually taken advantage of this yet.
Oh, I mean, it's definitely something we're looking at, right? It's something that we have been pushing on for many years. It is a long-standing dream. I mean, originally we refused to ship Firefox on iOS because it could not come with Gecko, and we
When
feel
was
like that is
this?
like, like what 20. I think we first shipped Firefox on iOS in like 2014,
Wow,
2015,
I didn't
something
know
like
that.
that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, for
Cool history
years,
fact.
like we were just like, it
Yeah.
wouldn't be Firefox. What would be the point, right? And then eventually, there were so many people using iPhones, and there's like a lot of synergy when you're using like browsers on your like mobile and desktop of being able to synchronize your bookmarks and all that kind of stuff, right? And there was just a sense that we had to also be we had to be there. We had to be a viable choice for whatever phone people wanted to use. And so, particularly if they were a Firefox user on desktop, we had to give them a seamless option to use on mobile. And so, we do have a WebKit-based browser on iOS today. But we have long advocated for being able to ship Gecko on iOS, just like we do on Android and just like we do everywhere on desktop, because like that's what we're about, right? We are about having an independently implemented platform and that being available everywhere. And so we were thrilled. We'd long advocated for stuff like that was in the DMA, and we were thrilled that they included a provision for engine choice. Unfortunately, Apple has made it quite difficult to actually deliver on this promise. So we have worked through a number of technical barriers and restrictions that have substantially slowed us down. We do actually have Firefox booting on an iOS device, but there were all sorts of restrictions, like we weren't even allowed to develop it if we weren't in Europe, right? And so like our technical lead like didn't live in Europe for this, like lived in Toronto, and it was like, well, she's gonna have to fly to like Europe, sorry, like she has to physically be present in Europe in order to launch this browser. And so eventually we got that resolved, but just like issue after issue like that. One of the current issues that's really holding things up right now is there's a requirement that it actually be a separate browser, right? So we already have Firefox. We have people using Firefox. It's an app on their iPhone, and it's in the store. We've got users, we've got ratings, all that sort of stuff. The idea is if we were to do this, we'd actually have to make a totally different one in the EU, right? It would be like the Gecko Firefox, right? It wouldn't be the same app. Stuff wouldn't be migrated. If somebody was to be using this app and then they were to leave the country, right, it would just stop working. And so all of these sort of distribution restrictions are just designed to make it completely unviable. And so it's something that we've continued to push on, and we continue to do some technical investments to really scope out what is possible. But it's not something that we're able to commit to shipping at this point until we get a little bit friendlier treatment from the platform.
Yeah, how do you, and I'll have this be kind of the last question here. How do you guys overall feel about the DMA? Because there's a lot of not great words about it from the big tech companies, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that a lot. I'm generally very happy with the DMA. I think I'm not a policy expert, so I don't want to be speaking to all of the aspects of it, right? But the two parts that have really made a difference for Firefox is number one, the browser choice requirements on platforms, and the fact that on Android and iOS, when users get a new device, like they don't necessarily get the default by default of the one of Chrome or iOS, but they're offered an opportunity to pick from one of the major or mid-tier browsers. One thing that would be really amazing, but is unfortunately not the case, is that Microsoft is currently exempted from this, and so that's not the case on Windows. And Windows is where we're seeing some of the most aggressive tactics of just people's default browser getting reset left and right.
Why is Microsoft excluded?
I think
it's okay if you don't know.
I'm not the expert on this, but the DMA has definitions of gatekeepers, and
I see.
there are regulatory processes by which certain platforms are designated. And at this point, Microsoft Windows has not been designated.
Okay, and so what do they do again on Windows to kind of prevent Firefox?
Oh, I mean, just things like every
I know, but
yeah, I mean, you like type something in the start menu, you type like Firefox, and then it's like, whoa, like switch to Edge. If you every time you install, like when you upgrade to Windows 11, it just resets your default browser away from Firefox. And the only like it is amazing actually the fact that Firefox still exists on Windows. Like we still have like most of our users on Windows, and that is like due to the passion of those users of going back to Firefox with their default being like constantly reset away from it. And so it is really really challenging to be operating on a platform that is so hostile and that is, trying everything they can to take market share away from you.
Wow. Yeah, I think when you put it that way, it's kind of wild they're not defined as a gatekeeper.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And then I guess obviously the other part of that is the engine choice provisions in the DMA. Those are a big deal. But we've definitely seen Apple have some success at weaseling out of the spirit of the law, and that is something that we would hope to see change in the future.
Got it. You guys are almost always the default browser on almost every major Linux distro that I've ever used. Is that because Firefox aligns the best with many of the values of most Linux distros, or are you guys like constantly in touch to kind of guarantee that you are a solid default option on a lot of these options?
Yeah, I generally think it is mostly the former. Like I think by and large, the vast majority of Linux distributions we don't have any formal relationships with at all. There are, like most of our staff use Linux, and so there are lots of passionate like Linux users that I think there's a lot of cross pollination. But in my mind, right, like philosophically, Firefox is about having a fully independent tech stack. And that is also what Linux is about. One that is not necessarily, like having a tech stack, top to bottom that isn't really controlled by one of the, major global tech powers. And so I do think that what we are trying to do philosophically aligns a lot with Linux. And we probably have some of our most, passionate users and supporters using Linux. And so, there's a lot more work to do, and we definitely encourage we are open to we would love to hear from Linux distros about like things that they want, and we try to make things easier for them, but our door is always open if people are having concerns or issues.
Nice. And then do you have any final words to kind of share with people, or something you feel like we missed?
Yeah, I think one other thing that I'd like to touch on briefly is that we talked about some of the historical threats to privacy online, but there are some new ones coming as well that I don't know if are necessarily on everybody's radar, but it's something that we're like really deeply engaged in. And I think that broadly speaking, there is a real threat to anonymity on the internet from a bunch of different angles and modern pressures, right? Of a lot of this has to do with regulation around, there's notions of government ID, right? There are regulations in different places to require browsers to help provision government ID to websites, which can be done in ways that are better or worse for privacy. There are age verification restrictions, and some of the worst versions of these are ones that require you to provision your government ID for the purposes of visiting a website, which basically undermines the entire model of you should be able to visit a website without first declaring who you are. And that, I think, is pretty central to our vision of the internet, and it's something that we're concerned about, and it's something that we're deeply engaged on sort of a technical and policy level to try to avoid. There's also, on another side, particularly with the rise of LLMs and AI, there's increasing pressure on the bot detection side to try to verify that people are human. And the natural way to verify that somebody's human is to know your customer and get their government ID, right? And that is something that we have a lot of concerns about. There are some technical proposals in this space based on some really good zero-knowledge crypto that we think can actually work. Apple has a version of this that only works with Apple devices because it just proves that you have an Apple device. Chrome has a version of this that is more federated, but unfortunately introduces like a lot of potential tracking entropy. But we've been working with them and have some really promising ideas on how to amend those proposals in ways that solve the tracking issues while still allowing you to basically carry around a federated bit that verifies from some unknown provider that you are human, right? Because ultimately, like sites are going to want that, and if we don't give them a better technical way to do it, they're just going to ask for your ID. So I think like around all of those things, and encryption as well, right? There's a lot of pushback on encryption from different governments around the world, of trying to make encryption illegal, make end-to-end encryption illegal, chat control, all this kind of stuff, right? And so I think that really my final takeaway message is that like, I don't think we necessarily realize how good we have it and how much of an anomaly this current moment in time is of how user-centric and privacy-first the technologies that we use are. And a lot of that is due to luck. A lot of that is due to hard work from a bunch of different players in the ecosystem. But there's a very real possibility that we backslide on these things. And we have to be vigilant, and we have to continue pushing forward to make the technology private and open for all.
Very well said. And I had a similar realization with all the content we've had to put out the last few months with all of these proposals you've talked about, and kind of realizing, man, this stuff is only happening now in 2025. This could have been happening 10 years ago. And this could have been how we've had to live life in the last 10 years. So even if things go sour, I think it's still nice to appreciate how much time we had without it. But no one's going down for the fight.
We're not resigned to that fate yet, right?
Yeah,
we're gonna continue fighting, and that is why it's important to have people working together on open and private technology for the web, and so I encourage anybody who's interested in those things to help get involved.
Great. So how can people keep up with you and or Firefox if they want to do that?
I would say we have we've got various blogs where we put out content around like stuff that we're doing, and the problem is it's like a lot of work, and so we've I think fallen behind a little bit on talking about all the privacy work that we're doing. Like we're still doing the technical work, but we just like haven't written the blog posts. But we're trying to correct that, and so you'll be seeing like more content on the Mozilla blog. We encourage people to show up in standards bodies, and there's a lot of participation on web standards these days with like the WWG, and our standards position tracker, like the thing where we provide our input to different standards proposals is all open, and people can engage there. But I think ultimately, my biggest request for folks is to use Firefox and to care about this stuff, and to indicate to people that it matters, and to honestly just to talk about this stuff, because I think a lot of people don't realize how dire the situation could become very quickly.
Got it. Well, thank you for your time, Bobby. And it's been an honor to talk with someone from the Firefox team. I know it's such a big part of the digital rights space as a whole. And so I just want to thank you for your time and for all of your insight.
Cool. Thanks. It was great talking.
Yeah. Once again, I want to thank Bobby for taking the time to do this interview, and also want to wish Firefox a happy birthday. It's their 21st birthday, which is pretty awesome. And I want to thank all of you for watching and learning a little bit more about the projects that you use, and a little bit more about your own privacy security and what you can do to help fight for digital rights. If you like what we're doing here at Techlore, these interviews are extremely fun to do, and I learn a lot from them, and I get all the comments from you guys that you learn a lot from them too. And the best way you can support them is by becoming a Techlorean, which you can do on Patreon. You can do it via our forum, and you can even do it directly on YouTube if you want to be a YouTube member. Any of those are much appreciated. We also support direct Monero tips if you want to avoid all subscriptions, and we also do one-off tips as well on our forum. You can check out all other Techlore Talks interviews in the Techlore Talks playlist, which is also a podcast on both YouTube and on Spotify and all other podcast platforms. I'll see you all next time on Techlore.